greatness. I had to look that up just to make sure I had it right, because that word's been ballied around a lot lately. Greatness means above average or normal, the ability or quality above the norm, most important, quality of eminence, being distinguished. Those are all greatness. Today we see greatness in a small thing, a small seeing of an insignificant act. Seriously, her act is not going to have a big impact on the treasury of the temple, I assure you. But the Greek in this text reads, and I love this, Jesus was watching how the crowd cast money into the treasury. He was looking at their faces. He was watching what was on their faces as they dropped the money into the treasury. And he noticed something in this woman. You see, Jesus is not just looking at how much each person is putting in. He's looking at how they make their donation. Joyful, sad, making a big show of it? Is it humility? Is it with great pride? What's their attitude? And he watches this poor woman put in a pittance, and he sees greatness. He calls his disciples over, and he says, I want you to notice this woman. Notice her. And again, I keep couching this because the whole week as I thought about this text, I kept saying Jesus seeing himself in that woman. Giving it all. Giving it all. In today's world of Disneyland and Donald Trump's, greatness can seem very big and only a bit by what Jesus calls greatness. See, Jesus is calling our attention to the power of the small. And in this country, it's always about big, the biggest building, the biggest church. A friend of mine who was a general minister for years wrote a book called 2020. And it's about the church and trying to create new churches. And he said, I was going to name it Steeple Envy because of all the political battles that pastors go to get the big church. The big church. But small things matter. Did you know a single butterfly 5,000 to 10,000 miles away can determine the course of a hurricane? This is what chaos theory came up with. It's called the butterfly effect. It's a real thing. The simple flopping of two wings of a butterfly thousands of miles away can set up a vector of changes that can subtly amplify themselves and actually change the weather enough to change the course of a hurricane. Wouldn't that be interesting? We're concerned that Hurricane Theo is going to be hitting the East Coast, so we've released butterflies in South America. Wouldn't that be interesting? It's amazing. And for those of you who've seen It's a Wonderful Life, and I love this movie, there's this black woman in there. She's actually one of the few black women that got hired in Hollywood. She's the housekeeper, and her name is Annie. You remember Annie from It's a Wonderful Life? Probably not. But there's one line in there that sticks out, and she shows what a great human being she is. When George is in trouble and all the neighbors are coming and putting their money in the clothes basket, she comes with this jar and she's pouring it in there, and they go, "Where'd you get all that money?" And she's got a big smile on her face, and she says, "I've been saving my whole life for a divorce in case I gets married." It's a wonderful line. It's anecdotal, but it's also, if you notice, she's the richest one there. You look what's on her face. I've been saving my whole life. It's a wonderful place, and it's almost not noticeable. It happens within the cacophony of all this wonderful joy. It's amazing. She gave it all. And Jesus has been trying to get his disciples to see. That's what he's doing here. If you look at, he's got, right before this, he cures the blind man, and the disciples don't get it. And Jesus is going, hey, how can I cure all these blind people and I can't get my disciples to see? And by the way, when he's talking to his disciples, he's talking to the church. Mark makes it very clear. He's talking to us. He gives sight to the blind, but he lacks the ability to give sight to his disciples. And over, he says, notice this. They're little things. Can you notice this? What are you guys, blind? You know, I have a friend, and some of you know him, Paul Reed. And I was taken aback one day when he came up and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Curse you, Red Hawk." And I went, "What?" He said, "I'm serious. I've been working downtown for 15 years. I go downtown every morning. It's wonderful. Sun's shining. I don't go downtown. Everything's wonderful anymore. Now I see all these homeless people. It's just amazing." He said, "You got me involved in this Heart Songs from the Voiceless, and I got to know homeless people. I got to know their situations, and now I can't help but see these people every morning. And they're out there, believe me. You get out at 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning and go downtown, and what happens is Catholic Charities lets out, and it's all these men. Half of them have mental problems, and they're just all over town. And of course, my view is I went down there in the morning to shoot some videos of it for the Heart Song, and I actually introduced myself to a few of them, got to know them. And I got to thinking, what would happen if every morning the guy who's on the corner going, "Hey," trying to wave down cars, but he didn't want anybody to stop. He's just trying to wave down cars. What if someone said, "Hey, Jim, how you doing this morning? Hey, Paul, how are you this morning?" You know, there's one guy down there, and he's got a big old plastic bag full of all his possessions, and he's walking around like this. He's paranoid. And he mostly stays in the alleys. You'll see him come out and go into an alley, and he's walking, he's going somewhere. What would happen if someone said, "Hey, Gene, it's good to see you this morning. I hope you're doing okay." But people, see, we avoid them. We don't see them anymore. Our own eyes, something is in the way. But I will tell you this. After Paul cursed me, he said, "What can I do this year for the show?" And every year he goes to Hamlin Presbyterian. Every year, as long as the Voiceless were there, we would get a check for $500-600 because Paul sat on the committee that had the money, and he was no longer blind. It's happening to us all. It's happening to us right now. We're going to go out here. We're going to miss stuff. We're not going to see it because we're blind. And mostly, if you look at it, it's because, well, we're white. I'm a guy. It makes me a little more blind. It's what culture does to us. In class, I actually came up with a word called chronocentric. Okay, we've talked about ethnocentricity, how our own culture traps us. Well, our time traps us, so we can't put ourselves back in biblical times because they're so violent. We can't understand how God had anything to do with any of that, some of us. But we're so trapped in our own time, we forget. And I'll tell you what, in 300 years, people are going to be chronocentric and look back at our time and go, how did they do all those little wars? How were they bombing each other? How could they do that to each other? They'll be trapped, and they'll be wondering how we could do it, what we were stuck in. Just as we're still wondering what Jefferson was stuck in, that he had to have a slave. Well, he was stuck in his time. We're all stuck in our time. And we have to get out of it. We have to get out of it. But I will say, Paul Reed has been there every step of the way. And when the scales were removed from his eyes, he helped every step. And sometimes we're given our sight by being forced to look at someone we would not normally look at. I know for me it was Down syndrome. I had no idea. You know, you see Down syndrome children, and I've shared some of when I worked at a mental hospital how bad some of those back wards were, and how what a poor quality of life. But what I didn't share with you is the back wards, where the women don't even get up. They're just tied down to their beds, and it was mostly women. And they're Down syndrome, but they can't do anything. They're just fighting all day, every day, 18 hours a day when they're not asleep. And they're just tied down, and they'll live their life that way, and that's what we do. We don't know what else to do with them. But I'll tell you, when I saw that, when I knew that we as a family were doing that was happening, and we didn't really know what else to do, something in me melted. When I see a Down syndrome child now, a whole different reality comes to mind, and it hurts because I'm no longer blind. And today, the world's on fire. We're in the middle of a globic empathic collapse. In other words, we talk about this in Sunday school, we don't feel each other anymore. You know, that's over there. That's somebody else's problem. I remember in Vietnam, I had friends would come back from Vietnam, and I'd say, well, what about the guy a mile down fighting? And he says, that was not my concern. That was his war. If no one was shooting at me, I was fine. And if the guns were coming a mile down, that was their battle. That was somebody else's war. The only war you had was the war that was right there. It wasn't like World War II, where it was one big war and everybody was in it. It was only right there. And we did that. We blinded our own people to seeing that we were a people. It happens all the time. The world is on fire. We have lost our ability to engage each other in genuine relationships. You know, we're talking about taking 11 million immigrants and sending them all to Mexico. Yeah. That's part of the political conversation right now. We're going to build a 1,000-mile wall, and we're going to send 11 million people back. Now, you think Syria has a problem with 1.5 million people leaving? Could you imagine the problem we would create with 11 million people going to Mexico? Are we thinking? Seriously, what are we thinking here? We're not, because we're being afraid. And this is where we're getting over and over. We keep coming back to our own fear. Enter origin. And I'm going to ask you all today, there's not a lot of us here today, is it possible to be a community in this day and age? I mean a genuine, real community where we don't judge each other, where we receive each other, where we actually try to respond to each other in love. Is that possible? See, what Origin is an experiment. It's an experiment in relationships. It's about, we're trying to notice those primary relationships that are part and parcel of a community if it's going to grow. And we can talk about the difference in these relationships and how there's this need for the relationships, but how do we grow those? You know, one of the things we're going to do is a community garden. And it's about how do we get people out here to garden? You know, there's a lot of apartment dwellers. If you're not gardening, all I can say is please grow something and just watch it grow. I don't care if you plant a one piece of grass, but plant it and watch it grow. And what's going on in that piece of grass or that flower or that tomato, it's happening in you too. That's a primary relationship that we're losing touch with. The community garden is going to try to teach that. And I'll be honest, if you sit there and do gardening with someone, you're going to start talking and relationships will happen. It's about relationship. Food happens. And what about camp? I talked to Jaden a little bit about camp. You know, all our kids go to camp, and they always will. Emma, how many years have you gone to camp? 7 years. Did it matter in your life?
Oh, yeah.
Why did it matter?
Because you've made great relationships at camp, and they just continue on.
And you know what?
Even long after you graduate, you can't go anymore.
Amen. And we're not a motorboat camp. Some camps you go to, and they have motorboats, and they have all kinds of things you can do. And yeah, we play. But mostly what we do is we try to notice what's going on between us about relationships. And when I go to pick up kids from camp, they don't want to come home. Seriously. You almost have to pull them away from each other. There were years when my kids were in camp. For the 3 days after camp, my basement was full of kids because none of them wanted to go home, so they just set up camp in my basement. Why? Because they were getting a foretaste of what God calls us to. And that's genuine community. And look at worship. You know, I try not to be judgmental. I really try. I try to stay and keep on the thread of love, that we might find God's love in the midst of our own truths, that we might do life. It's not, you know, one of the greatest honors someone said to me is, Red Hawk, you don't tell us what to think, you try to teach us how to think. I want you all to think for yourselves. I want you to trust the life inside of you where your life and God's life meet. That's the junction where it's happening. And that's the junction this lady knew. And that's the junction Jesus was noticing all over the place. And look at our study. You know, I'll admit, I've been challenged. Our study gets a little academic. And we get up there. And I I want to apologize for that, but I really don't. So I'm sorry, but I'm not. I'm just trying to do my faith, and I'm trying to do it in a way that shares it. And I think, whoever said all good preachers are narcissists with an inferiority complex, and I've said that before, I think that's true, and welcome to me. But I want you, all of you, I want you to see that what's going on here is because of you. It's not because of me. It's because of you, of what you give, of when you put in your 2 cents, of when you show up, of when you do the study, of when you participate in worship, when you work on stewardship and service, and see that these are part of who we are as a people. Jesus noticed this woman because his eyes were tuned to what God sees. I can't remember who it was in class, but someone said it's about getting inside and seeing through their eyes. And when we do that, something happens to us. When I see things through your eyes, I see what you're stuck